Why not merely the despaired of occasion of word shed? Is it not better abort than be barren? The hours after you are gone are so leaden, they will always start dragging too soon. The grapples clawing blindly the bed of want, bringing up the bones, the old loves, sockets filled once with eyes like yours. All, always, is it better too soon than never? The black want splashing their faces, saying again, 9 days never floated the loved, nor 9 months, nor 9 lives. Saying again, if you do not teach me, I shall not learn. Saying again, there is a last, even of last times of begging, last times of loving, of knowing, not knowing, pretending, a last even of last times of saying, if you do not love me, I shall not be loved. If I do not love you, I shall not love. The churn of stale words in the heart again, love, 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 thud of the old plunger, pestling the unalterable, way of words, terrified again, of not loving, of loving and not you, of being loved and not by you, of knowing, not knowing, pretending, I and all the others that will love you, if they love you, unless they love you.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I'm excited to share with you a summer's worth of reading notes, basically. I started off by just wanting to make a video on the trilogy, Molloy, Malone Dies, and the Unnamable, but as I started going back and reacquainting myself with the work of Samuel Beckett and reading some work I had never read before, I pretty much blew my whole summer on reading works from Samuel Beckett. So much fun was I having. So I added in Murphy, and then I added in How It Is, and then I added in Watt, and I eventually told myself, hey listen, just don't do Waiting for Godot, because the video is already going to be of gargantuan length, and Waiting for Godot is so well known that people whom I'm convinced have never read a book before recognize at least the title, Waiting for Godot. As of the time of recording this little intro, I have just finished reading the bilingual edition of Waiting for Godot from Grove Press while watching a performance from the San Quentin workshop, and I'm not sure if I can hold off on adding a clip on Waiting for Godot or not. We'll see what happens, but just suffice it to say that every time I revisit that great play, I'm reminded of just how profound it is and how much meaning there is for every one of us. I would like to note for whoever's interested that I used separate paperbacks for all of my readings because I didn't want to dip into and diminish the quality of my box set of the selected works of Samuel Beckett. I do this a lot. I am actually currently rereading Adam Levine's The Instructions, and instead of tampering with my hardcover, I snapped up a cheap paperback. I tried to operate under 3 constraints for this video. Even though it's super long, I tried to make sure that each clip for each book that I'm talking about could stand on its own. Meaning, if you want to use the table of contents in the description and just skip around or go and listen to what I have to say about this or that book, please feel free to do so. But my second constraint was to try to make sure that the entire video watched from beginning to end linearly would benefit that viewer and listener from an accumulation of connections and points that I'm making across all the work. And then the third and most difficult constraint I put on myself was to limit repetition. So in the midst of making each review standalone, but also the entire video a nice, coherent, and insightful experience, I didn't want to constantly repeat things in each video if I could help it, or at least not in the same way. Even though that would have been a pretty cool, like, sort of meta allusion to the work of Beckett, which is highly repetitive in some cases, but you guys would benefit more from experiencing Beckett's repetition than mine. Certainly. We should all take a moment to be thankful for the time we're living in when it comes to the work of Samuel Beckett. I'm convinced that had we been living in the times of some of his early work, which was largely dismissed and unheard of, we might well have totally missed out on Beckett. But we're in a world now where his genius has been recognized and absolutely solidified. Really, one of the universal draws to Beckett as a writer and as an artistic genius is that it's a rags to riches type of story. And furthermore, once the rags went to riches, the riches did not in any way spoil the integrity of his artistic desire. To go from having your first novel rejected by 42 publishers and then only selling something like 17 copies when it was picked up by somebody, to winning the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1969, some 35 years later or something, is just really, really inspiring. Beckett is such a peculiar and interesting person. He is the tortured artist par excellence. He is Kafka's hunger artist. You'll often hear his work associated with minimalism, but cast aside any idea that that has something to do with the minimalism whose lineage goes from Sherwood Anderson to Ernest Hemingway to Raymond Carver. This is a totally different type of minimalism. Descartes and Gerlinx are, without a doubt, the most important philosophers to Beckett and his work. Yet, Schopenhauer gave him an intellectual justification for pessimism and unhappiness. Some people may wonder, now that I've read through a lot of his work, where should I start with Beckett? Well, I would say that if you have never read Beckett at all, and you like those sort of disorienting postmodern works, then jump right into the trilogy with Molloy. If, however, you care more for the conventional novel, then jump in with Murphy. If you jump into Molloy and you love it, press on into Malone Dies and the Unnamable. If you jump into it and you don't like it, please go back to Murphy. If you don't like either one of these, please give Watt a shot. I love Watt, still my favorite of Beckett's novels. If you've already read all of these and you love Beckett and you haven't checked out How It Is, rush off and get it right now. Beckett's work, to me, stands apart from the symbolists and surrealists and existentialists in his search for true isolation, true silence, and true nothingness. To label Beckett's work as the theater of the absurd and dismiss it as just another one of these writers who wastes paper to basically communicate the idea that not getting it is the point, is to totally miss what Beckett is doing. And it also is sort of tantamount to trying to resurrect old tools for analyzing new work. Beckett's is a very special complexity, and we have to go ahead and accept the fact that with an author who's using language to try to get beyond language, our approach and our thinking as readers is going to have to change. It's going to have to be ruptured by the work and then rebuilt by the work. Perhaps the most concise statement I can say about Beckett's work overall is this. Beckett spent his entire life laboring torturously over satisfyingly capturing in language nothing, and he failed perfectly. What we as readers take away from the experience of these failures, that is the point. Some years later, a reporter asked Beckett how a small country like Ireland could have produced so many great writers since the last half of the 19th century. "It's the priests and the British," Beckett replied tersely. "They have buggered us into existence. After all, when you are in the last bloody ditch, there is nothing left but to sing." At a party, Henry Miller, who had been drinking, crossed the room abruptly and told Beckett that he had too much talent to waste it imitating Joyce. Beckett made no reply, but quickly left the party. For Beckett, the perfect stage vehicle is one in which there are no actors or directors, only the play itself. When asked how such theater could be made viable, Beckett replied that the author had the duty to search for the perfect actor. That is, one who would fully comply with his instructors, having the ability to annihilate himself totally. Beckett says, "The best possible play is one in which there are no actors, only the text. I'm trying to find a way to write one." "If you insist on finding form, I'll describe it for you," Beckett replied. "I was in hospital once. There was a man in another ward dying of throat cancer. In the silence, I could hear his screams continually. That's the only kind of form my work has." In all of this century, it would be difficult to come upon another writer who has so lived through his art that it has become the substance of his life. Beckett himself insists that his life is dull and without interest. The professors know more about it than I do. He abhors the interest in his person and insists with intense sincerity that nothing matters but the writing. There has been nothing else worthwhile. That reminds me of the famous quote from Gaddis's The Recognitions about how the artist is nothing more than the human shambles that follows his art around. Permanent secretary of the Swedish Academy cast the deciding vote that awarded the prize to Beckett for a body of work that, in new forms of fiction and the theater, has transmuted the destitution of modern man into his exaltation. Characteristically, Beckett wrote Joyce, not he, should have received the prize, for Joyce would have known what to do with it. I decided to lend some biographical context to my reading of Beckett's novels using the first biography that came out. Samuel Beckett, a biography by Deirdre Bair. At the time, she was wrapping up her PhD dissertation, and she decided to write him a letter and send it to him there in Paris, explaining why she felt that a biography was necessary. And amazingly, Beckett consented to having this biography written. Of course, he was his usual stony and reticent self, but after meeting with Deirdre Bair there in Paris a couple of times, he decided he would do nothing to prevent her access to the things she needed and the people she needed to talk to. I like this book because it is perfect for what she set out to do. As she makes clear in her preface, she didn't come up with some unifying thesis to drive the work. She decided instead to just simply record and construct a picture of his life from birth in 1906 all the way up till a few years after he received his Nobel Prize in 1969. It cuts off about 1973. And along the way, she would face the work of Samuel Beckett as it came out and seek to analyze the work only insofar as it was in the context of Beckett's mind at the time. In other words, she was sort of going against the grain of her academic setting. Critics tended to try so hard to place Beckett in whatever particular theory or system they espoused that they ignored those works that did not fit. I began to write a biography, intending to concentrate on the life of Samuel Beckett's mind, to find out as much as I could about the circumstances that led to the writing of each work, place these works within the framework of his daily life. And I found that intertwining the reading of this biography with the readings of his works as they were coming out worked perfectly to give me a fuller picture of his life and circumstances, and mostly the turmoil through which he produced his body of work. As I said in my video on Benjamin Moser's Why This World, his biography of Clarice Lispector, when I'm reading a biography of a writer, I like to think in terms of a few different categories. So here I'm thinking of Beckett the man, the person, Beckett the writer, Beckett the reader, and then Beckett's work. So I'll try to give you excerpts that stood out to me in each of those categories. The historical setting, of course, is 1906 to about 1973. So we have in Ireland, with Samuel Beckett growing up in the affluent area of Foxrock, we've got the 1916 Easter Uprising, which hits right at the time he's about 10 years old. Then, of course, in 1922, we've got the establishment of the Irish Free State and the civil tensions and civil wars that would come out of that. And in 1929, we've got the establishment of a national sensory board, which would ultimately drive Beckett to publish his works in Paris and maintain this sort of rift between Ireland and the expatriate there in France, Samuel Beckett. Even though he was largely apolitical and disdained politics, he held out in France at the outbreak of World War II all the way to the end and made his way, had to flee to the countryside of France, and even joined into one of the local chapters of the Resistance. All around Beckett, senseless arrests and killings were commonplace. Even more devastating was the knowledge that numerous friends were either collaborating openly with the Germans or indirectly toadying to them. He found himself unable to remain neutral any longer. For the next 2 months, together and apart, meaning Suzanne and Beckett, they moved from one Paris hideout to another. At one point, Beckett hid for 10 days under the false floor of an attic. Another time, Beckett hid in a tall tree in the woods outside Paris with another member of the Réseau, while below them, Germans made periodic patrols with dogs and guns. When they were able to get away, they found temporary refuge in a safe hotel, where Beckett's companion, his mind unhinged by the ordeal, jumped from a window and killed himself. For his work with Gloria, which was the part of the Resistance network, Samuel Beckett was awarded the Croix de Guerre with a gold star on March 30th, 1945. The citation was signed by General Charles de Gaulle, President of the Provisional Government of the French Republic. The war had turned Samuel Beckett's life upside down and was probably one of the most important factors in his development as the writer who captured the imagination of post-war society. But he had no need to keep it in the forefront of his life. As in one of the old Dutch paintings he admired so much, the war was part of his background, the idealized landscape, the necessary contrast accentuating the main figure, whose brooding, introspective eyes seemed to stare with alarming relevancy while still hinting of an unreal private time and place. Becket the man. May, Beckett's mother, was determined to conquer his stubborn refusal to be reached, his unwillingness to show all the ordinary emotions, from fear to affection. And he was just as determined to maintain his independence from her domination. The battle of wills between mother and son began when Samuel Beckett was little more than 3 years old, and it continued through periods of rage and depression for the length of May Beckett's lifetime. Critics and scholars have refused to accept Beckett's insistence that he cares nothing for the trappings of organized faith and insist that he is profoundly religious, even stating with assuredness that he reads the Bible daily. "I am aware of Christian mythology," Becket replies. "I have had the Bible read to me as a child and have read the writings of others who were affected by it and who used it in one form or another. Like all literary devices, I use it where it suits me. But to say that I have been profoundly affected by it in daily reading or otherwise is utter nonsense." For Samuel and his brother Frank, there was guilt for loving their father so much when their mother told them repeatedly how disgraceful was his behavior. There was shame that they loved him who was so bad and hated her who was so good, and therefore deserving of their love. These emotions, instilled in Samuel Beckett when he was very young, became the source of severe mental anguish that plagued him for the greater part of his adult life and found their way repeatedly into his writings. Dejuna Barnes was one of the few women with whom Beckett had maintained lifelong friendship. He was apolitical and walked away from any conversation that veered into politics. He felt that artists had no business concerning themselves with anything but art. Beckett was fascinated with physical deformities, fantasized about what he called deadbeats, and asked endless questions about the abnormalities of the people he saw. Probably the most important aspect of Samuel Beckett's self is and always has been best described by the word control. Until this time, he had always been the one in any of his relationships to decide how close he would allow others to come to him. He hoped to find a persona within himself, among his own features and entrails, which would provide him with a rationale for being. Because all else had failed him, he could find no relief in anything but what he called Baroque solipsism. Jung mentioned a 10-year-old girl who had been brought to him with what he called amazing mythological dreams. He could not tell the child's father what the dreams signified because he sensed they contained an uncanny premonition of her early death. Indeed, she did die a year later. She had never been born entirely, Jung concluded. Beckett seized upon this remark as the keystone of his entire analysis. It was just the statement he needed to hear. He was able to furnish detailed examples of his own womb fixation, arguing forcefully that all his behavior, from the simple inclination to stay in bed to his deep-seated need to pay frequent visits to his mother, were all aspects of an improper birth. He had no time for politics. He accepted life fatalistically, and political activity, even discussion, was a waste of time. Suzanne Deschavaux du Mesnil was a prominent and constant figure for most of his life. She was a French woman who became a lifelong partner, yet a platonic partner there in Paris with Beckett. She seemed to sense that Beckett, who claimed to have had his fill of surrogate mothers, really could not do without one. She has devoted her life to filling his every need, from providing food and doing laundry, to acting as his literary agent and even, for a short time, financial provider. He came to know Marcel Duchamp very well, and he played some of the most stimulating chess games of his life. When a friend of Beckett's met Beckett, he said that he thought Beckett a very strange person, uncommunicative to the point of rudeness, with one overriding fixation: mothers. Mothers of anything, Bonnelly remembers. Dogs, cats, humans, anything. When a neighboring laborer complained in Beckett's presence that he was loath to go to work since it meant leaving his old and ill mother alone, Beckett insisted on taking the man's place, declaring emphatically that one should be with one's mother. His attitude toward women ranged from careless indifference to basic distrust and irritated dislike. He gave the impression that women were necessary inconveniences, and in an an attitude that his French friends found very Irish, professed to find true happiness only in the company of good male companionship late at night in a pub. The American painter Joan Mitchell and Beckett became companions at a time in Paris, and it was to Mitchell that he turned when his life there became too hectic. She was the one person with whom he could drink, relax, and talk, and her friendship became a crutch he leaned on heavily. Beckett mentioned his innate passion for knowledge, which demanded periodic satisfaction, leading him to confide shyly that he secretly dreamed of reading through an entire multi-volume set of an encyclopedia. H.O. White wrote on behalf of Trinity College to ask Beckett if he would consent to receive an honorary degree of letters at the next commencement. Beckett was genuinely surprised at Trinity's offer and replied that he felt he had no right to it, saying that White was well aware of his need for personal obscurity and dread of public notice. However, there was no question of his declining such an honor from his own university and that he would accept it with emotion and gratitude. Beckett quietly loaned large amounts of money to keep Éditions de Minuit afloat. Beckett had become the center of a hub of Irish writers who lived in Paris, as Joyce had been before. However, his relationship with the new generation was different. While Joyce encouraged adulation and accepted favors as if they were his natural due, Beckett went out of his way to do favors rather than receive them. When he joined the Irish cronies for long nights of drinking, they found it difficult to pay for a round because Beckett insisted it was his right to do so. He introduced several of them to Linden, who subsequently published their books. If he thought he could be helpful in promoting a magazine, an anthology, or a collection of poetry, Beckett would delve into his trunk and give a manuscript without charge. "Keep my share of the swag," he would say of royalties. "Give it to some poor, deserving person." Let's take a look at Beckett, the writer and reader. There were few books other than school books in their aerie, and they all belonged to Sam. He kept them on a small shelf above his bed, and by the time he was ready to leave for boarding school, he had amassed quite a few, as, to his family's surprise, he had become an avid reader. Neatly placed on the shelf beside his books was a small bust of Shakespeare. Later, he acquired a larger bust of Dante, which he kept on the windowsill because he liked the way the light changed as the sun moved across the crags and crannies of Dante's hawk-like visage. More important in his essay about Joyce's work in progress are the oblique references to what would later become his own literary credo, the reduction of life and humanity to its simplest, most basic function and form. What is ultimately important about his early creative writing is that poetry is the form that first attracted him. His essay on Proust shows how much Proust influenced Beckett and is probably his first attempt to formulate a literary credo of his own. The essay reveals Beckett's literary conscience in its formative phase. With hindsight, it is much too easy to see the mature Beckett revealed in this essay and to ignore the subject, Proust and his multi-layered novel, for this essay is still today one of the finest introductions to it. Beckett considered Proust one of the two geniuses of the 20th century. In the early more pricks than kicks, there is none of the technique of interiority divorced from physical landscape that characterizes Beckett's later writings in French. For Beckett, being banned in Ireland was the same as being praised. All poetry, as discriminated from the various paradigms of prosody, is prayer. Art results from the artist's quest to rid himself of extraneous knowledge in order to refine his perceptions into a clear, distilled vision of the fundamental inner being. Art comes from the abandonment of the macrocosm for the pursuit of the microcosm. Man is doomed to failure, for he can never commit or abandon himself completely to his inner voice. The eternal struggle to do so, and the artist's constant turning inward, creates conflict and in turn forces him to create art. Because he was without access to psychiatric help during this long period of being on the run and in hiding during occupied France, Beckett was forced to muster astonishing reserves of self-control, to disguise his real intentions and feelings, and to force himself to act as if nothing untoward were happening, as if his inner being were not a raging battleground. He discovered that the most effective way to bring himself under control was to channel all his confusion through his writing. And this would culminate in Watt, my favorite of his novels. Beckett wrote Watt in a desperate attempt to stave off complete mental background and filled the book with dialogues and scenes from his own life. As Bair says, it is the sort of novel a man might write who wanted relief, solace, and intellectual release from his physical surroundings. "I'm not interested in stories of success," Beckett snapped. "Only failure." He confessed that he was doomed to spend the rest of my days digging up the detritus of my life and vomiting it out over and over again. He continued in a more positive mood, though, saying, "Optimism is not my way. I shall always be depressed, but what comforts me is the realization that I can now accept this dark side as the commanding side of my personality. In accepting it, I will make it work for me." There was a pattern which continued repeatedly from that time on as he came to the end of the work, that time being him writing his trilogy in French. First, there was euphoria, complete satisfaction with the writing, an eagerness for publication, and a confidence that it would be well received. Then, self-doubt would take hold of him until it grew into an obsession. He would be unable to face the work, for he had a positive horror of reading what he had written. It was too much of a shock to discover what he had dredged up from his unconscious. It was so self-destructive that he actually had to prepare himself to gird up to reread it. As for Becket, he had a hard, steely core which allowed him to control his feelings about the absurdity of writing, and to overcome these feelings by his compulsion to write. He simply wrote, oblivious of the outcome. So much activity required Beckett's attention that he wrote nothing during 1951 and had no new work in mind. His only concern was Godot. He decided to step in and take a more active role in bringing the play before an audience. It was one of the most important decisions of his life. In effect, it signaled the end of his career as a writer of prose and the beginning of his long involvement with drama. Barney Rossett wanted to introduce Americans to the newest and most exciting writings in Europe. Becket was one of the first authors he signed for Grove Press. At Grove Press, there was a standing joke that they had both a house style and a Becket style, and they scrupulously followed the latter, no matter how it might deviate from the former. Becket the reader was heavily influenced by French literature and Italian literature, especially in Italian, Dante, Pirandello, but many other of the classics. Manzoni, The Betrothed. In French, it was the French playwrights, Racine, but also the symbolists, Rimbaud, Verlaine, Valéry, André Breton, Charles Baudelaire, and of course, Mallarmé. A huge influence was René Descartes, Arnold Gerlinks. Samuel Johnson took his attention for a very long time, and in fact, Becket tried to produce a play about Samuel Johnson. Proust, of course, St. Augustine, Bible to a degree. He had become an omnivorous reader. He read Descartes voraciously and filled 3 large loose-leaf notebooks with his own thoughts and impressions, as well as excerpts from critics and biographers. He referred continually to French poetry for ideas he adapted to his own use in criticism, and later in his beginning attempts at writing poetry. From Vielle-Griffon, he moved on to Rimbaud, Baudelaire, and Apollinaire, finding in them techniques of allusiveness and arcane symbolism that suited his own style. But most of all, he found himself returning again and again to the 5th canto of the Inferno, the never-ending flight of those who sinned in the flesh, the carnal and lusty who betrayed reason to their appetite. This is the canto which figures most often in Beckett's writings. Dido, Cleopatra, Helen, and others, all swept away by passion. Also the tragic canto in which Dante is overcome by the sad story of Paolo and Francesca. He got into Schopenhauer for a time. Schopenhauer's ideas would become in later years the philosophical foundation of much of Beckett's thoughts and the system with which he felt most at ease. I've also heard it said that Schopenhauer gave Becket an intellectual justification for pessimism. Of all the French writers he read during this time, the one who had the most influence on his own later writing was Jules Renard, the novelist and diarist. For Becket, Renard was a man who had found the secret of the perfect approach to life, how to live it completely within himself, to examine himself minutely, to write about this examination, and yet to inhabit the outer world with tranquility and contentment. Plutarch's Lives and Berkeley's Commonplace book he read for inspiration. He began to use the Trinity Library for a time and soon became a familiar figure as he sat hunched over a book, his shabby raincoat draped on the back of his chair. Mostly, he was lonely, disappointed, and faced with long stretches of empty time because he could not write. He turned again to Schopenhauer, read Nietzsche, and contemplated the futility, sterility, and boredom of his life, while waiting and hoping for something to happen. To occupy his time, he began to frequent the local lending library, where he decided to work his way through the English classics. He read The Mill on the Floss, thought Eliot's treatment of infancy commendable, and was struck by how much Dickens took from her. He thought Jane Austen had much to teach him, but was disgruntled with what he called her insistent use of the cult of the home. He read Ben Jonson's plays, which he found superb but of little value to him personally. Abruptly, he decided that all English literature was based on banality, typification, and simplification, which amounted to nothing more than a mere listing of the vices and virtues. From Austen to Aldington, he proclaimed, English literature was straight out of the Chester cycle. He turned to Balzac, marveling in Cousin Bette at Balzac's bathos of style and thought, claiming such a book could not possibly have been written seriously, but must surely be parody. He spent a lot of time reading, in his own word, wildly. Goethe, Racine, Chesterfield, Boccaccio, Fichart, Ariosto, Pope, Cecil's Life of Cowper, to which he said, "What a life! It depressed and terrified me. How did he ever manage to write such bad poetry?" A memoir of D.H. Lawrence. Appalling, he said. And finally, a single-minded concentration on the writings of Samuel Johnson and all the writings about him. He had finally read Céline and said that The Journey to the End of the Night was the greatest novel in both French and English literature. But Joyce, to him, was the master. There was no one equal to him. He existed on one plane in literature, alone and incomparable. He was utterly absorbed in Roger Casement's Black Diaries, which he thought were both authentic and fascinating. Also, Freud's biography. But a friend sent him an Aldous Huxley novel, and Beckett couldn't read it. Can't take him anymore. I never could. No use. Unremittingly smart. He fell into the habit of concentrated reading to fill the periods when he could not write. He usually read through the entire canon of a particular author. And at this time, this is about 61, 62, he was absorbed in W.B. Yeats's collected poems. In the past, he had deliberately shunned Yeats's poetry. And of course, we have to talk about the relationship of Joyce and Beckett. Bair does a good job of making it clear how they were perceived and how it actually was. It was perceived that Beckett became a sort of sycophant or acolyte who was attempting to ingratiate himself in the life of the great master, but simply became a sort of secretary or errand boy. Beckett did revere Joyce's work and Joyce as a man. Here was someone whom he idolized. Yet this relationship was thrown into such tension that they eventually had a falling out because Joyce's daughter, Lucia, became romantically enamored of Beckett. And Beckett, in his typical way, really did not understand how to react to and process such attention from a woman. Besides Beckett's intelligence and wit, one of the reasons Joyce was so eager to establish him in the role of amanuensis was the snobbish pleasure it gave. Always intrigued by the trappings of the rich and the near rich, Joyce was fascinated by Beckett's affluent background. One of the most oft-repeated fallacies is that Beckett was actually Joyce's paid secretary. This has always annoyed Beckett to the extent that he stresses that he was never officially in Joyce's employ. Beckett sincerely considered Joyce to be one of the greatest writers of this century, if not of all time. Beckett stepped into the void by reading to Joyce and taking his dictation for passages of work in progress. And there's, of course, the famous anecdote that while he was typing out this dictation, someone knocked at the door and Joyce said, "Who's there?" And that made it into the work. And when Beckett was reading it back to him, Joyce was like, "What? Where did that come from? Who's there?" And when they figured it out, Joyce said, "You know what? Leave that in." It would be during the French occupation in 1941 when Beckett was fearing for his life and on the run and in hiding that Joyce would pass away. And though he and Nora were buried in Zurich, a contingent of writers and admirers petitioned to have the remains exhumed and moved to Ireland. At this point, Beckett washed his hands of the entire affair. They sort of appointed him as heading up the logistics of this affair. He was horrified at the thought of Joyce's body being moved to Ireland in the first place, and he wanted no part of the general fuss and commotion that seemed likely to materialize if it were moved. When Joyce's friends eventually decided he should at least have a monument there in Zurich, Beckett's only part in the affair was an offer of financial contribution. Beckett had been free of Joyce's shadow since 1939, but now their names would begin to be linked irrevocably. At first, Beckett was pleased by the association, but as time passed, the constant facile comparisons became a source of irritation. The nagging fear that he would never quite escape Joyce became more and more a reality, as the comparisons increased in number. Beckett was trying to avoid everybody, but it became more difficult to avoid Richard Elmon, who had the cooperation of Joyce's family and his literary executors for the writing of a definitive biography. Beckett met Elmon several times, but was guarded and elusive in his answers. He abhorred the idea of the projected book and resented what he construed as pressure from the heirs and friends to talk to a stranger about a friendship which was too deeply personal for him even to be able to think about clearly. Ever since I first found out that Alexander Theroux did his master's thesis and his PhD dissertation on Samuel Beckett, his PhD dissertation being specifically on the language of Samuel Beckett, I knew I wanted to somehow get my hands on it and read it. And with this summer spent reading through the works of Samuel Beckett, it seemed the right impetus. So I contact Stephen Moore and it shows up in PDF. This is his University of Virginia PhD dissertation, approved in 1968, and it is entitled The Language of Samuel Beckett. It basically starts out by surveying and summarizing the concept of language and its relation to reality from the Greeks and ancient Hebrews all the way up to what he calls the watershed of Wittgenstein. Before that, the French symbolists ruptured our conception. For a long time, our conception and dealing with metaphysics in philosophy didn't interrogate the artificiality of language or treat language as its own object, as happened going into the 20th century. It was only going into the 20th century, and especially with Wittgenstein, where we start to look at language and talk more about the definition of a thing instead of just using language as a means of talking directly about the thing in itself. Once Theroux sets up this contrast of the long assumed conception of language and then the way that we deal with language philosophically and artistically now, he will go on to use Beckett's primary works, mainly the works that I'm covering in this video, to situate 4 different facets of the language of Samuel Beckett. One is the language of contradiction. And what contours can incarcerate the image of rational man after Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, Kafka, or Camus? What, finally, has driven man to realize that because contradiction is inherent in reality, in order to cope with that reality of experience, we now need a logic of paradox, accepting a principle that A and non-A do not exclude each other. And it's interesting that as I was reading through this, so much of what I've been thinking about and coming in contact with ever since Blanchot earlier this year was coming up in my mind. And eventually, Theroux will bring in the space of literature from Blanchot himself. The second facet is the language of silence. The logic of silences, that which is beyond language, simply is impossible to demonstrate in a world defined by that wherein everything is the case, nodding to the Tractatus. The logic of the artist, then, his style, suffers the discriminations imposed upon it by the mystical, the unspeakable, the void, an unbearable presence. Unbearable, as Beckett says, because neither to be wooed nor to be stormed. It seems to contain in itself the impossibility of statement. No king of infinite space, rather bounded in a nutshell, which is, of course, Theroux's allusion to Hamlet. The Beckettian protagonist is plagued by the syntactically bad dream of having to say nothing. However, the absolute demands itself to be investigated, intrudes itself on man. Nothing is more real than nothing. He quotes that from Malone Dies. He is, as Wallace Stevens says in his poem on New Haven, a neuter shedding shapes in an absolute. And here we get that concept of the neuter form in Blanchot. To employ language against that absolute is to create a religion with a fallible God. The next facet is the language of nothing. As an alternative to waiting, again, a refuge is sought in words to stuff the void, pass the time, fill the vacuum. And finally, the language of tradition. The traditional literary ambiance, if not the classic verbal medium, extends to the central design of Samuel Beckett, not otherwise anti-novelist and anti-playwright. his strange modifications of language, form, and meaning take as their point of departure: 1. The ironical novel of the 17th and 18th centuries; 2. The roman philosophique of Montesquieu and Voltaire; 3. The A-literature of the Nouveau Roman, seen by Claude Mauriac, as epitomized in Proust, Joyce, and Gide, and formed from the rib of Dostoevsky, and he nods at notes from the underground, and Kafka; and 4. The eccentric experimentation of the 1930s, notably Dadaism and Surrealism, which destroyed the accustomed procedures of the novel and drama. The whole dissertation is written very clearly and engagingly. It has the learning of a philosopher and a scholar, but it also has the pizzazz of a creative writer. The notes of the Theroux to come. Of course, this is before he turned to the literature of revenge. He employs an impressive knowledge of literature to be someone who's not even out of college yet. And he goes far beyond even philosophy, history, and literature. He includes interesting uses of Niels Bohr, Euclid, and Godot. Here are some other highlights that I think will help frame other things that I'll talk about throughout this video. Beckett seeks out the formal effects that arise from the relation between words and things. The tragedy, parentheses, the art, is that he fails in that attempt. And so he makes an art out of seeking the formal effects that arise from the relations between words and things and failing. To say something of nothing is the problem that isolates Murphy, drives Watt mad, kills Malone, destroys the Unnamable, harasses the subhuman in How It Is, humiliates Dee Dee and Go-Go, petrifies Ham and Clove, forces Crap into silence, makes ridiculous the Roonies in All That Fall, Winnie and Willie in Happy Days, and Henry in Embers. Here, Theroux captures 5 salient features of Beckett's language. To understand the strange linguistic perspectives of Samuel Beckett is to first understand the extent of expressiveness in the language he employs, which holds forth, it seems to me, 5 salient features. 1. The language calls attention to itself. 2. The language avoids subject matter. 3. The language has little referential power. 4. The language suppresses reality. And 5. The language exists in a void. And then he goes on to select a sampling of what he refers to as the countless examples of these salient features in Waiting for Godot. Kafka, like Beckett, sought the irreconcilable paradox of a freedom beyond all words, a freedom from words, which could, Kafka adds, be achieved only through literature. Literature then becomes a process of exorcism to reach to the silence. Language becomes a tool to deal with that silence. The art that attempts this is the art of failure. And this recalls Samuel Beckett's quote that he's not interested in stories of success, only failure. The trilogy, Molloy, Malone Dies, and The Unnamable, stands as the embodiment of an impossible art. And, like the earlier novels, Murphy and Watt move towards an impatience with literature and language that is so severe as finally to make the art of fiction, the art of intelligibly orchestrating or trying to orchestrate the ultimate silence. One anecdote in here that I hadn't come across before is that Samuel Beckett once asked a mathematician, "What is the color of pi?" The language of nothing takes Beckett one step beyond the silence, the cross-purpose dialogue, the play on words. For in Beckett's plays, we witness the Euclidean point, that which has no parts. Beckett says nothing. Theroux points out that Robbe-Grier's Jealousy, which contains more repetitions than any work in the history of the novel, according to Bruce Morissette, is, I believe, surpassed by Watt, written by Beckett 16 years before. But I would like to add that still another 18 years before Watt came the highly repetitious Making of Americans by Gertrude Stein. To close off the dissertation, which occurs in the section on the language of tradition, where Theroux masterfully shows how indebted Beckett is to previous literature. He says that Beckett takes language into a dimension, words as objects, most infrequently seen, is not, however, to sever him from a traditional debt most emphatically there. It is curious that readers of Beckett forget, once his books are set aside, that he is so rich in knowledge, that his books, expunging so much of what is generically representative of the novel or play in all its strictly traditional forms, are, in fact, coextensive with life itself, no matter how renegade the motivation. To hear in Beckett only the repetitions of the flat declarative sentence is to miss hearing the insistence of a bolder, more emphatic line beneath it. His relentless pursuit of almost infinite refinement by language and by form has found no disenchantment, but rather crucially important correspondences with that literary tradition which, like the sun, mentioned in Beckett's first sentence of his first novel, Murphy, having no alternative, shone on the nothing new. If you'd like for me to send you a PDF copy of this dissertation, just send me an email. It will enrich your experience of Beckett's work. Murphy is Samuel Beckett's first novel published in English. And in fact, it had to be published in London, not Ireland. And even then, after 42 different rejections. Murphy, in the way that it's written, is unique to the Beckett oeuvre because it's unlike the scholarly pieces such as his essay on Proust and his contribution to the anthology Examination for celebrating the work in progress by James Joyce. It's different from that academic stuff. It's different from the ultra erudite and somewhat juvenile more pricks than kicks. And yet after this one, all of his work, they're totally different and in more of the signature style that we've come to associate with Samuel Beckett, that literature stripped down to its barest core. Deirdre Bair gives us some good insight into Murphy. Beckett meant Murphy, heir to the line of anti-heroes begun with Bellecois, to demonstrate the possibility of successfully living the Cartesian duality of mind and body without the necessity of integration. Of all Beckett's novels, Murphy is the most controlled, the most polished. Nevertheless, Beckett himself found Murphy a trifle too commercial, too willing to pander to public taste, which is kind of ironic looking back on its constant rejection. Beckett had chosen Murphy as the title for several reasons. Because it was the most common surname in Ireland, thus standing for the Irish everyman, and because he had loved Fritz Lang's movie M and wanted to pay it homage in some way of his own. Houghton Mifflin's editors were afraid the title was too Irish and would limit the book's appeal. This one has the conventional niceties and trappings of a novel. It's got a plot. It's got characters that move toward a denouement. It's got conflict. It's got a conclusion. It's got beautiful scenes. But it also has all of the themes that will be at the forefront of Beckett's work. In fact, we open up with Murphy, who is tied by 7 scarves to a rocking chair, and he's rocking himself into a sort of trance. And of course, it ends very poorly for him with him flat on his face. But nonetheless, we find that this character, Murphy, like Samuel Beckett, his creator, is obsessed with Descartes and the mind-body dualism. And at first he's obsessed with pinning down where that bridge is between mind and body. And then, of course, as we know from the mature Beckett, he's most interested in severing that connection because sort of like the theories that are put forth in Anti-Oedipus, schizophrenia and capitalism, he sees the mentally insane, the schizophrenics, the mental patients that populate his conception of a psych ward at the Mary Magdalene Mercy Seat in this book as being truly free. They are completely free to live in their mind only, divorced from the body and all of its ills. And as we know, Samuel Beckett had a lot of ills externally and especially bodily. In the short 6th chapter, we get the formulation on which this work hinges from inside the mind of Murphy. Thus, Murphy felt himself split into a body and a mind. They had intercourse, apparently, otherwise he could not have known that they had anything in common. But he felt his mind to be body-tight and did not understand through what channel the intercourse was effected, nor how the two experiences came to overlap. He was satisfied that neither followed from the other. He neither thought a kick because he felt one, nor felt a kick because he thought one. Perhaps the knowledge was related to the fact of the kick as 2 magnitudes to a third. Perhaps there was, outside space and time, a non-mental, non-physical kick from all eternity, dimly revealed to Murphy in its correlated modes of consciousness and extension. The kick in intellectu and the kick in re. But where then was the supreme caress? Again, like his creator, Murphy is addicted to stillness, is addicted to darkness, is addicted to silence. He feels this longing to silence the body completely in order to set the mind free, to set the self free in his mind. A lot of the conception of this is not only coming from Descartes and Arnold Gerland, but also from a lecture that he attended with none other than Jung. Jung explained that at the core of the mind of the human, there is this darkness, and that represents a zone that the external self, the superego, borrowing from Freud and so on, tends to suppress. This is sort of like the id, but it contains all of the personality that's normally kept in check. In schizophrenics, this area bubbles up and overshadows all the rest of the self. That proposition drove Beckett in this book and in all subsequent books. The narrative is both simple and complex. It's simple in a high-level, broad stroke in that Murphy is being pressured by his soon-to-be wife, Celia, to get a job. This has correlations with his own family, his mother May and his brother Frank, pushing him to get a job and pull his weight while he's, in conflict with that, trying to establish himself as a writer. Murphy eventually lands a job at the Mary Magdalene Mercy Seat institution, where he becomes obsessed with one patient that is a composite of a lot of patients he met in real life. And that composite is Mr. Enden. Meanwhile, Celia is looking for him, and a woman, Miss Cunahan, who's infatuated with Murphy, is looking for him. And there's this sort of band of close friends who are all connected in these various love and interest triangles, and all of them have some reason to be seeking Murphy and yet can't find him. And so they go from place to place, involved in all these capers and foils. Meanwhile, Murphy is dead set on connecting with something that he wants, that the schizophrenic Mr. Enden has. And the pivotal moment comes in a chess game that they play, which then prompts the ending for Murphy, an ending that will appear again and again in the work of Samuel Beckett. But aside from the importance in Beckett's canon of work, and aside from its philosophical foundation, Murphy is just simply fun to read. It's great writing. It has tons of humor, mostly black humor, ironic humor, and it has so many fresh sentences. On one page, for example, early on in the book, we get this sentence: "A foot from his ear, the telephone burst into its rail." R-A-I-L. And then towards the bottom of this subsequent paragraph, we get "the loud, calm crake of the telephone mocked him," which is just wonderful in its own right. But the proximity of rail and crake, I looked up crake because I wasn't familiar with that word, and it said that it was the rasping cry of the corn crake, which is a bird of the rail family. So I saw this clever connection that he had put in there with these novel words. Speaking of an old man's face, this is Celia's grandfather, Mr. Kelly. He says, "The ravaged face was a cramp of bones." Wonderful. There's also a character, Miss Carriage. So these Joycean-like puns and plays on words. But this is how she's introduced. Miss Carriage's day had a nucleus, the nice strong cup of tea that she took in the afternoon. I love that. Someone's daily ritual referred to as their nucleus. The only thing Murphy was seeking was what he had not ceased to seek from the moment of his being strangled into the state of respiration, the best of himself. So instead of saying since the moment of his birth, the way that Beckett formulates the moment of someone's birth is from the moment of his being strangled into a state of respiration. And this is precisely how Beckett would formulate such a thing as being born into this world. The way he formulates the action of two characters kissing is this slow motion osmosis of love's spittle. And then, in sort of a wink to all the censors of the time, he says, "The above passage is carefully calculated to deprave the cultivated reader." And again, he kissed her in Lydian mode, and went to the door. Lydian mode comes from the Greek conception of these modes of music as compared to the Dorian mode, which is more melancholic and sad. The Lydian mode is sort of happy and bright. And then later, we'll get this dialogue that's interspersed with a single paragraph set in one word that says rest, and then speaking rest. So I love these additions of musicology. Even the very first sentence is something that can be examined and chewed on for a while. It says, the sun shone, comma, having no alternative, comma, on the nothing new. And so thinking about the sun shining on the nothing new, of course, this sort of implies Ecclesiastes 1 with the Koheleth or teacher saying there's nothing new under the sun. But with that appositive of having no alternative, that could modify the sun to the left as the sun having no alternative, the sun not having free will. Or it could modify the right phrase, on the nothing new, meaning there's no alternative but nothing new. And then the next sentence sort of turns all of it. Murphy sat out of it as though he were free. And so implying that Murphy is sitting outside of the sun, meaning that the sun is only shining on the nothing new. And if Beckett's out of it, then he's something new. Therefore, he's free. But don't make a mistake of jumping to conclusions with Beckett or Murphy, because his real view is implied here. What but an imperfect sense of humor could have made such a mess of chaos? In the beginning was the pun, and so on. And once again, I will not say alone. No, that's not like me. But how shall I say? I don't know. Restored to myself? No, I never left myself. Free, yes. I don't know what that means, but it's the word I mean to use. Free to do what? To do nothing. To know. But what? The laws of the mind, perhaps. Of my mind. That, for example, water rises in proportion as it drowns you, and that you would do better, at least no worse, to obliterate texts than to blacken margins, to fill in the holes of words till all is blank and flat and the whole ghastly business looks like what it is. Senseless, speechless, issueless misery. Next up is Molloy. Molloy is the first in what has come to be called the Beckett trilogy, which comprises Molloy, Malone Dies, and then the Unnamable. In retrospect, you may want to read Watt between Murphy and Molloy, but for me, as part of this Samuel Beckett July, I wanted to save Watt to the end because that's my favorite of all of Beckett's novels. Molloy is totally set apart. It's a stark contrast between Murphy and Molloy, like I've said. Murphy is much more indicative of that conventional novelistic style. He sets up all of his foundation of what's to come, but the form, if you flip through the novel, it's going to look like a conventional novel. Molloy is totally different. Now, in the respect of the goings-on and the content of Molloy, it sort of reads as if Murphy, from the earlier novel, taking his cue from the schizoid Mr. Enden, figured out how to attain that mental state of Mr. Enden. And so now we've gone from Murphy to inside the head of Murphy, here, though, in the form of Molloy. Just flipping through it, you'll see walls and walls of text. Here, Beckett has dispensed with all of those pleasantries and niceties of the novel, such as set off dialogue in quotation marks, or at the very least the continental dash that Joyce was fond of. Paragraph breaks. No need for them. Yes, the style and syntax is as stark as the worldviews that are being portrayed. But even though this way of capturing the bare bones of the human experience through your syntax and through your language and style, even though it can be very staccato at first, you'll acclimate to it. And before you know it, you'll be off in the flow of these ADD disorder thoughts. Though with every squirrel the narrator chases down, the squirrel matters, or the chase matters. Well, nothing really matters, but it all has a point. Let's use the text to describe this character, Molloy. I was perched higher than the road's highest point and flattened, what is more, against a rock the same color as myself, that is, gray. I am not a pretty sight. I don't smell good. Deep down is my dwelling. Oh, not deepest down. Somewhere between the mud and the scum. I sleep little, and that only by day. This sort of reminds me of Poe in the poem, I can't remember the name of it, but it talks about those who only dream by night are not cognizant of the things of those who dream by day. The liquid overflowed, the mug rocked with a noise of chattering teeth. Not mine, I had none. As with the mode of droll humor that permeates this entire novel, you'll see that a lot of the references to his physical attributes or his physical deformities or maladies are done as sort of asides. Like, oh yeah, and by the way, I don't have any teeth. Oh yeah, by the way, I'm gray. Oh yeah, by the way, there are no toes on one foot. Nonetheless, he says that he has a passion for truth. The confusion of my ideas on the subject of death was such that I sometimes wondered, believe me or not, if it wasn't a state of being even worse than life. So I found it natural not to rush into it, and, when I forgot myself to the point of trying, to stop in time. There again, of course, one of the most notable things about Beckett's work is the obsession with death, with suicide, with the pointlessness of life, isolation, stillness, destitution, but somehow captured in a way that makes you laugh a lot. Again, there are many links to Beckett himself, the contentions between Beckett and his mother, May. Here, Molloy's mother is named Mag, and a lot of what's happening is the sort of recounting of all of the neuroses that Molloy has in conjunction with the presence of his mother. He desires the death of his own mother. He desires the freedom and transcendence that will bring for him. Nevertheless, we see him escaping into the dark and confusing woods, which in the psychoanalysis of the day was indicative of returning to the womb, returning to the mother, to woman, or what Freud called that dark continent. Constipation is a sign of good health in Pomeranians. Of course, Beckett, his character, is always obsessed with bodily functions, with bodily abnormalities, and as constipation goes, Beckett himself suffered horrible bouts of constipation, in addition to many other ailments. Yes, I once took an interest in astronomy. I don't deny it. This is very indicative of Beckett's studies and interests in astronomy and how they played a role in situating time in Murphy. For me, there have always been two fools, among others. And this is bringing up the notion of multiple selves or multiple personalities within us. In many ways, because of the lecture of Carl Jung that Beckett attended, in Beckett's estimation of the human mind, the human experience, we are all suffering from a repressed multiple personality disorder and schizophrenia. It's all compressed in this dark center. Beckett and his characters, like Murphy, like Molloy, want to go and set those personalities from that dark center free. Again, Molloy mentions Arnold Gerlinks, who was the Belgian philosopher that Molloy says left me free. And indeed, it would be Gerlinks and Descartes who really conditioned or started the process of Beckett's philosophy. Molloy mentions himself as bristling with boils ever since I was a brat. And as Deirdre Bair's biography makes very clear, this is something that would have constantly been on Beckett's mind because he indeed suffered these horrible boils that had to be lanced or just allowed to rupture, causing him horrible pain. The novel is divided into two parts, and part one gives us this unbroken stream of the inside of Molloy's mind. And then for part two, and they're both about equal in size, for part two, we jump into the first person of Jacques Morin. And Jacques Morin is a sort of hybrid bounty hunter and inquisitor and psychiatrist in this Catholic bureaucracy, and a messenger has come to him as he is a case worker or agent and has charged Jacques Morin with going and finding Molloy and then handling him. These two halves are a wonderful contrast of two different characters set inside the same existential problems and yearnings, but from two different perspectives. And just as Molloy has sought to achieve a total stasis of the physical body so that the mind can be free. And so it's sort of a loophole around suicide. Jacques Morin can't commit suicide because within the bounds of the Catholic institution, suicide is a sin. And in fact, Dante will drive this in the Inferno with the wood of the suicides in the seventh circle of the Inferno. Becket, of course, was obsessed with Dante to the point where he had that bust of Dante on his windowsill as a kid. He read all of Dante over and over, loved him. And so it's interesting because Becket himself was neither Catholic nor Protestant, but of course he grew up in a Catholic-dominated country, and he was fascinated by and obsessed with Dante, which would have imparted a lot of the Catholicism. Yet at the same time, his family came from a stock of French Huguenots. And I'm proud to say that I also come from a stock of French Huguenot. In fact, my father's side is French Huguenot, the Villas, but it used to have an R at the end, Viard. And my mother's side is Irish, from the Logans. Interestingly, too, there's some intertextuality that's going on because Jacques Morin refers to the fact that he also worked cases that included Murphy, Watt, Yerke, and now Molloy. In the midst of all of this destitution that Samuel Beckett is so well known for raising into an art form. And in fact, it's one of the main reasons that were cited for him receiving the Nobel Prize. And in the midst of all this droll humor, we get these great thoughts that just sort of like poke through and arrest your attention. Then the murmurs began again. To restore silence is the role of objects. And when I read that, I thought to myself, this is sort of the inverse of the normal view. Objects, phones, computers, whatever, cars, they tend to bring noise into our life. But then I realized that the reason this is correct for Molloy is that it's stated from the point of view of the interior. With the interior murmuring away, we could plausibly say that it's that dark center from which all the murmurs issue. It's an external object that'll sort of give us a reprieve from that. In other words, exteriorly thinking, I know people who don't like silence to the point that they leave music or the TV on all night while they sleep. I remember David Foster Wallace in an interview saying that we even pump Muzak into bookstores now because we can't stand silence. At one point, Molloy says, the shadow in the end is no better than the substance. And I think that with that, he pretty much explodes Plato's cave theory. There could be no things but nameless things, no names but thingless names. And so with this, Molloy introduces a rupture in semiotics. The connection between signifier and signified is severed in the same way that Molloy, Murphy, Beckett want to sever that bridge between mind and body. This one statement that comes out, the indestructible chaos of timeless things. I played with that for a while and just sort of massaged it with my mind. And I thought to myself, if Joyce gets the ineluctable modality of the visible, then certainly Beckett gets the indestructible chaos of timeless things. It's really amazing how Beckett can get so much mileage out of so few things. Just a character walking through a desert, basically, and he can go on and on and on. This is the vibrancy of the uninhibited mind. So much of this also reminds me of Rudolf Wurlitzer. I did a video earlier this year of his novels, and I mentioned that huge presence of Beckett here. And in hindsight, I think that reading Wurlitzer is what sort of catalyzed me now wanting to go and dig through Beckett again. But these games of logic and perspective and these figures that flit in and out in an environment that's stripped down to just a few external objects, a stick or a pebble, or the now famous 16 sucking stones. I think there's really something there with the sucking stones that I've never seized on before. And he mentions Isaiah and Jeremiah specifically. And, in Jeremiah, at least, God had to turn the heart of stone to a heart of flesh. So I was just thinking about the symbol of a stone in the mouth. Instead of a mouth of flesh, we have a mouth of stone. There's something about silencing of the tongue, the stony tongue, not yet turned to flesh. But I'm still sort of bandying this about in my mind. I turn to William H. Gass's wonderful philosophical essay on being blue, in which he notes that beautiful passage about the sucking stones and the philosophical or logical conundrum that Molloy faces. And about it, Gass says, Beckett is a very blue man, and this is a very blue passage. Several brilliant pages are devoted to the problem. The penultimate solution requires that 15 stones be kept in one pocket at a time and moved together, all the stones, that is, which are not being sucked. There is, however, an unwelcome side effect, that of having the body weighted down on one side with stones. And here's a beautiful conclusion that Gass takes from that. De Sade, in a harem of quints, could not have faced the issue of love's little nourishments more squarely. Like that unpocketed peppermint which has, from fingering, become unwrapped, we always plate our sexual subjects first. It is the original reason why we read, the only reason why we write. Even though Jacques Morin is free enough to say something like, oh, the stories I could tell you if I were easy. What a rabble in my head, what a gallery of moribunds. Murphy, Watt, Yerke, Mercier, and all the others. I would never have believed that. Yes, I believe it willingly. Stories, stories. I have not been able to tell them. I shall not be able to tell this one. And in the end, his attempt to find Molloy, to assess Molloy, certainly to set him free or cure him or whatever he's sent to do, he can't even remember the instructions that were given to him. Like so much in Beckett, the expected outcome or moment of denouement is thwarted. And yet, though Jacques Morin appears free enough to look at cases like Murphy and Molloy as just totally hopeless and destitute and crazy, from what we get in the second half of the book Molloy, is Jacques Morin really any different? Next in the trilogy is Malone Dies. And just as the narrator of these three novels is diminishing more and more, so the size of each novel diminishes more and more. Though Beckett himself said that Molloy best captures his experience of life, as a reader, I actually find Malone Dies more pleasurable. Here we have a even further stripped down setup. It's just an old dying man, Malone, who is bedridden in this room where he is able to use a stick to pull things over to him, such as the table that's on casters that some unknown woman, of whom Malone has only seen the hand, reach in and change out his chamber pots and put soup in there for him to eat each day. He decides to write stories until the moment of his death. While waiting to die, I shall tell myself stories if I can. They will not be the same kind of stories as hitherto. That is all. They will be neither beautiful nor ugly. They will be calm. There will be no ugliness or beauty or fever in them anymore. They will be almost lifeless, like the teller. As he says from the start, my need for prettiness is gone. I could die today if I wished, merely by making a little effort. Malone is casual, non-committal, vacillating, waving away questions and contradictions as inconsequential. Malone is, of course, another instantiation of the Beckett signature character that started with Murphy and then went through Mercier and then Watt and then Molloy and now Malone. Malone says, but perhaps I was stunned with a blow on the head. In a forest, perhaps. Yes, now that I speak of a forest, I vaguely remember a forest. All that belongs to the past. In a way, there are these hints that Malone is actually Molloy. The moon, on the other hand, has grown familiar. I am well familiar now with her changes of aspect and orbit. I know more or less the hours of the night when I may look for her in the sky, and the nights when she will not come. So just as for Molloy, the sucking stones sort of represented the mother, here the moon is the mother. But again, I think Beckett would scoff at this. And again, Malone says, I part my lips. Now I have the pillow in my mouth. I have. I suck. And at another point he says, I love to suck. But the sucking again is always something divorced from human connection. Like Molloy, Malone says, I myself am very gray. I even sometimes have the feeling that I emit gray. Again, there's this droll humor that pervades Beckett's work. There is a providence for impotent old men to the end, and when they cannot swallow any more, someone rams a tube down their gullet or up their rectum and fills them full of vitaminized pap so as not to be accused of murder. I have spoken softly, gone my way softly, all my days, as behoves one who has nothing to say, nowhere to go, and so nothing to gain by being seen or heard. The isolation, the hermeticism, the disconnection from the external world is growing as we push through this trilogy. The style in this one is such that we get these section breaks, which represent these lacunae insofar as Malone falls asleep while writing or loses his pencil somewhere in the bed sheets. The structure of the text is not as orderly as that of Jacques Morin from the second part of Molloy. Eventually, he'll give way to these streams. And what's notable about this one, and part of why I say it's more pleasurable to read, is the humor is, yes, more droll. The Beckett signatures are more pronounced. But there's a poetic beauty that is in here that you don't get in either Murphy or Molloy. Dead world, airless, waterless. That's it. Reminisce. Here and there, in the bed of a crater, the shadow of a withered lichen, and nights of 300 hours, dearest of lights, wan, pitted, least fatuous of lights. That's it. Babel. The sound I liked best had nothing noble about it. It was the barking of the dogs at night in the clusters of hovels up in the hills where the stonecutters lived, like generations of stonecutters before them. It came down to me where I lay, in the house in the plain, wild and soft, at the limit of earshot, soon weary. The dogs of the valley replied with their gross bay, all fangs and jaws and foam. From the hills another joy came down. I mean the brief scattered lights that sprang up on their slopes at nightfall, merging in blurs scarcely brighter than the sky, less bright than the stars, and which the palest moon extinguished. In that same section, it opens with a scene that is reminiscent of Proust in the Recherche, where he wakes up and the whole novel, I can't remember which one it is right now, but the whole novel opens up with him being able to determine the outside conditions, the weather conditions, without even looking. He's just listening. And it's like my friend Brian Counter says, his internal weather can ascertain the external weather. When I stop, as just now, the noises begin again, strangely loud, those whose turn it is, so that I seem to have again the hearing of my boyhood. Then, in my bed, in the dark, on stormy nights, I could tell from one another, in the outcry without, the leaves, the boughs, the groaning trunks, even the grasses and the house that sheltered me. Each tree had its own cry, just as no two whispered alike when the air was still. It's really interesting that Beckett, though he loved Proust and knew the work very well, as Deirdre Bair says, his essay on Proust is still one of the greatest, most striking introductions to the work of Proust. And though in the same way he was enamored with Joyce, and yes, some of Beckett's early works, Horoscope notably, did have that Joycean erudition and linguistic play. It's interesting that despite these two major influences, Proust and Joyce, Beckett would nonetheless contrive his own style, his own voice. Nonetheless, we get to see some of that Proustian influence here. Again, a beautiful passage here, thinking of Beckett's piercing blue eyes, what he referred to often as gull's eyes, as in seagull's eyes. Bluer scarcely than white of egg, the eyes stare into the space before them, namely the fullness of the great deep and its unchanging calm. It's beautiful. The whole text of Malone Dies is shot through with these striking thoughts. I wonder if I am not talking yet again about myself. Shall I be incapable to the end of lying on any other subject? This is such a wonderful turn of phrase, and echoes indeed something that Beckett himself was uncertain of, the constant autobiographical content. So much so that when he finally got someone to accept and take a chance on Molloy and Malone Dies and the Unnamable, he suddenly was incapable of even discussing the contract, and he had to have his partner Suzanne take care of a lot of the initial discussions because suddenly he was horrified at the thought that, oh, this stuff's going to be on display. I'm going to be exposing myself and my life. But I know what darkness is. It accumulates, thickens, then suddenly bursts and drowns everything. Then, as people do when someone even significant dies, they summoned up such memories as he had left them, helping one another and trying to agree. But we all know that little flame and its flickerings in the wild shadows, and agreement only comes a little later with the forgetting. Again, his turns of phrase are so wonderful in Malone Dies. I, whose every move has always been a groping, and whose motionlessness, too, was a kind of groping. Yes, I have greatly groped stock still. 1,000 little things to report, very strange in view of my situation, if I interpret them correctly. But my notes have a curious tendency, as I realize at last, to annihilate all they purport to record. In this way, we could view Malone's, Beckett's writing these things out, telling of these things, as a form of annihilation. As we know from the title alone, the big event here is that Malone dies. And so he's writing up to and casting his death, his very death, in literature. This is sort of going one step beyond what Blanchot did in The Instant of My Death. But here comes prose that's shorn and molded to capture this moment of that mortal precipice. A few lines to remind me that I too subsist. He has not come back. How long ago is it now? I don't know. Long. And I? Indubitably going, that's all that matters. Whence this assurance? Try and think. I can't. Grandiose suffering. I am swelling. What if I should burst? The ceiling rises and falls, rhythmically as when I was a fetus. Also to be mentioned, a noise of rushing water, phenomenon mutatis mutandis, perhaps analogous to that of the mirage in the desert. The window. I shall not see it again. Why? Because, to my grief, I cannot turn my head. Leaden light again, thick, eddying, riddled with little tunnels through to brightness. Perhaps I should say air, sucking air. All is ready, except me. I am being given, if I may venture the expression, birth to into death, such is my impression. And then finally in the end, the structure, the style of the prose on the page as a visual element to the novel matches what's happening as we get those last breaths, the dying breaths of Malone. And now we come to the third installment in this trilogy, The Unnamable. Hitherto, everything has had a name, albeit, a single first name. Murphy, Watt, Mercier, Molloy, Malone. But now we've gotten to a place where we can't even assign a name to this narrator, so The Unnamable. One way to think about this novel is just like those philosophy of mind exercises that are called brain in a vat. Here we get a homunculus in a vat. The Unnamable is the shortest of the three novels. However, it took me the longest to read. This one is much more difficult, but enigmatic and disconcerting. Beckett is taking the foundation of what he started in Murphy and now pushing it to the brink and even slightly beyond the brink of where he can go in this stripping back of physicality or corporeality and the external world. I have always been sitting here at this selfsame spot, my hands on my knees, gazing before me like a great horned owl in an aviary. Past happiness in any case is clean gone from my memory, assuming it was ever there. I only see what appears immediately in front of me, and I only see what appears close beside me. Apparently, this homunculus in this jar used to be able to turn his head a little bit. Now he can't even do that. And the things that he sees passing him by are very interesting because he sees Malone, Molloy, Murphy. That the jar in which he is suspended, is really standing where they say, all right, I wouldn't dream of denying it. After all, it's none of my business. Though its presence at such a place, about the reality of which I do not propose to quibble either, does not strike me as very credible. No, I merely doubt that I am in it in the jar. It is easier to raise a shrine than bring the deity down to haunt it. But what's all this confusion now? That's what comes of distinctions. No matter. Again, we have this female character who tends to the narrator. For the woman, displeased at seeing me sink lower and lower, has raised me up by filling the bottom of my jar with sawdust, which she changes every week when she makes my toilet. And so what this narrator does is he imparts the story of how he has basically deteriorated over time in this jar, both physically and mentally. And then he imparts these other stories of unnamed people who are in these ironically chilling situations faced everywhere with death. What happens here is perhaps the deepest self-excavation of all the novels in this trilogy. And in fact, what happens is that Beckett will bring this around to where he, as writer, is in this text and it is becoming self-confrontational. He thinks he's caught me, the narrator says, and this he to whom he refers appears to me to be Beckett. He thinks he's caught me. He feels me in him. Then he says I, as if I were he, or in another. Let us just be. Then he says Murphy, or Molloy, I forget, as if I were Malone. But their day is done. He wants none but himself, for me. He thinks it's his last chance. He thinks that they taught him thinking. It's always he who speaks. Mercier never spoke. Morin never spoke. I never spoke. I seem to speak. That's because he says I, as if he were I. I nearly believed him. Do you hear him? As if he were I who am far, who can't move, can't be found, but neither can he. He can only talk, if that much. Perhaps it's not he, perhaps it's a multitude, one after another. It's the fault of the pronouns. There is no name for me, no pronoun for me. All the trouble comes from that. It's a kind of pronoun too. It isn't that either. I'm not that either. Let us leave all that. And here I can see Beckett working towards a perspective, towards a pronoun that Blanchot discovered as what he called the neuter. Who is I who cannot be I, of whom I can't speak, of whom I must speak? That's all hypotheses. I said nothing. Someone said nothing. It's not a question of hypotheses. It's a question of going on. It goes on. Hypotheses are like everything else. They help you on, as if there were need of help. That's right, impersonal. And that's what that neuter form from Blanchot was, is the impersonal, this speaker from the background. And in his conception, just like in Kafka, it causes this sort of disturbing, ominous presence. And of course, like most of Beckett's narrators, the intent here is set out for us early on. I hope this preamble will soon come to an end, and the statement begin that will dispose of me. And so we see again that this is a striving towards death, or in here, striving to find a statement, find a language that will finally bring oblivion, dispose of the narrator. All these Murphys, Molloys, and Malones do not fool me. They have made me waste my time, suffer for nothing, speak of them when, in order to stop speaking, I should have spoken of me, and of me alone. Another way to look at this is again through Jung's lecture that had such an impact on Beckett. And this, the Unnamable, is the instance where we get to see Beckett press as deeply into that dark center of his psyche as he can possibly get. And so language becomes very important. How do you find a language with which to dispose of yourself, with which to press into a center that is seemingly beyond language? This is the kind of language I can almost understand. These, the kind of clear and simple notions on which it is possible for me to build. I ask for no other spiritual nourishment. It's a lot to expect of one creature. It's a lot to ask, that he should first behave as if he were not, then as if he were, before being admitted to that peace where he neither is nor is not, and where the language dies that permits of such expression. There we have it at last. There it is at last, the right word. One has only to seek in vain, to be sure of finding in the end. It's a question of elimination. That is, eliminating all the unnecessary words. When all goes silent and comes to an end, it will be because the words have been said. The words are everywhere, inside me, outside me. Well, well, a minute ago I had no thickness. I hear them, no need to hear them, no need of a head, impossible to stop them, impossible to stop. I'm in words, made of words, others' words. What others? The place too, the air, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, all words. The whole world is here with me. Why then not speak of something else? Something the existence of which seems in a certain measure already established, on the subject of which one may chatter away without blushing purple every 30 or 40,000 words at having to employ such locutions, and which, moreover, supreme guarantee, has caused the glibest tongues to wag from time immemorial. It would be preferable. But no, for Beckett, he can't just go with what's already been done. It's a truly virtuosic, enigmatic, paradoxical text that really stirred a lot of what I had read and thought when I confronted the works of Maurice Blanchot earlier this year. In the end, at roughly 100 pages, Beckett has achieved something that no doubt casts his name as eternal in the annals of literature. You can really go crazy with this text, but in the end, like this narrator says, into the dossier with it in any case, in support of whatever thesis you fancy. Just when you think Beckett can't push his art beyond what he has done in the Unnamable, he comes out with How It Is. If form is content and content is form, just as Beckett himself said of Joyce's then work in progress in the offering that Beckett gave for the Examination anthology, then How It Is probably the supreme example of that proposition in the whole Beckett canon, I would say. There is no punctuation now. No commas, no periods, no question marks, no exclamation marks. There are no indentations. There are no paragraphs, really. It's just blocks of text with white space in between each block, as in a section break. It will take some getting used to, just like a lot of Beckett's work. And in fact, it's really something. It's really remarkable that a single artist could cause me to have to sort of recalibrate my readerly diagnostics in order to approach so many of these books differently. It's more akin to the prose poetry of the French symbolists that Beckett himself loved so much. It's sort of a synthesis of prose, poetry, and theater. In other words, all of what Beckett has done in his capacity as artist. We get stage directions. The narrator refers to moments within these word blocks as scenes and episodes. Brief black, and there we are again, as if a curtain has come down and then come back up. And then to end this word block, the scene is shut of us. So again, we get the classic Beckettian simple language, but novel word choices. The scene is shut of us. Deirdre Bair, of course, gives insight into the writing and the circumstances of Commencer, or How It Is. Beckett equated Paris with a nightmare from which he was trying to escape. At this point, he's famous. People are constantly telephoning him, dropping by, sending telegrams, wanting interviews. He wanted to be able to stay in Ussy, his country house there, because he was finally getting started on prose after his long dramatic works period. He envisioned a work divided into 3 parts and had written the first. He expected it to be short and more difficult and impersonal than anything he had written thus far. With each word, he felt that he crawled an inch nearer to something miles away. The work became Commencer, the perplexing prose work his critics have called a novel, for want of a better word. He was still working on Commencer, but could not bring himself to write more than 2 or 3 hours a day. So it advanced very slowly, and he thought it was very bad writing. He admitted that he had always written fast, too fast, and rationalized that this was perhaps a fault. He was deeply involved in Commencer, and it was as personally disturbing as the trilogy, had been. In fact, by the time he finished with the trilogy, he really didn't want to go back to those treacherous places within his psyche. Commencé continues Beckett's chief preoccupations: the problem of identity, the obsession with words, the nameless teller of tales. The only stops throughout are the natural pauses for breath. This technique is an integral adjunct of the text, for the voice can only speak when he has stopped panting, and the spaces between verses are meant to indicate labored breathing. Beckett destroys by refutation the entire concept of the book in the closing pages, sort of like what Wittgenstein does at the end of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. What remains is mud, slime, and darkness through which the speaker crawls, dragging his meager possessions with him in the pitiful sack he holds naked against his belly. In Commencé, Beckett was trying to find a form that accommodates the mess. That is the task of the artist now. The recalcitrant printer of Commencé claimed first that it ruined his eyes, then that it was pornography, and he would not set the type. It's a very interesting piece of writing. The narrator, which is always using the impersonal pronoun to sort of remove gender, remove sexuality, is face down in the mud, muttering these words while trying to climb to a point with this sack of wares usually tied around his neck. In fact, by the end of the book, I myself felt as though I had been in this muck and slime, belly crawling along with these splinters of Beckett's psyche, and really uncertain of my survival. We still find that preoccupation with not having been born, or not having been born properly or fully. The narrator will say, if I was born, everything is doubted, everything is negated, as we've seen in the language of contradiction and refutation throughout Beckett. We still have Beckett trying to find not only a language for this isolation and nothingness and destitution, but also a tense, a verbal tense, to be present, past, future, and conditional, of to be and not to be. Come, enough of that. On and end part 1 before Pym. Part 1 is before Pym, part 2 is with Pym, and part 3 is after Pym. Pym is this figure, one of many monosyllabic figures that feature all throughout the canon, but here we get the I of the narrator, we get Pym, whose presence creates the idea of time in the 3 parts of this novel. Then we get Bom, Bim, and in fact, now that I'm thinking on it, it almost seems that these monosyllabic proper names that come straight out of the imagination, within the mind within which we are of the narrator, are akin to the variables in mathematics. And so they're just pointers, they're just referentials. And in fact, towards the end, the text itself will start to become mathematical, including mathematical variables, A, B, and the intersection or combinatorial of A, B. Some readers have pointed out that there's a love story, a very Beckettian love story, of course, between the narrator and Pym. And in fact, there are deeply touching moments, and more in terms of sadness and loss, because as the 3rd part is divided into after Pym, we see how the time with Pym there in the middle invigorated somewhat the life of I, but now we're left with an even more pronounced isolation. It's kind of like, is it better to have loved and to have lost than to have never loved at all? The language here is so incredible. After so much life, there are moments. One of these word blocks ends, and that sets up a theme that throughout we'll see that the whole of life, these vast distances, as one of the refrains has it, is really just made up of these moments. It comes, the word we're talking of, words I have some still, it would seem, at my disposal. At this period, one is enough. Aha, signifying, mama, impossible with open mouth. It comes, I lit it at once, or in extremis, or between the two there is room to spare. Aha, signifying, mama. So sort of like at the end of the Unnamable, those magic words, all of this verbal groping is to find the magic words, the word that will unlock something. I want to read 4 contiguous text blocks for you so that you can get an idea for how this sounds. And remember that there's no punctuation, no capitalization, no commas, nothing. My life above what I did in my life above a little of everything, tried everything, then gave up. No worse, always a hole, a ruin, always a crust, never any good at anything, not made for that farrago. Too complicated. Crawl about in corners and sleep. All I wanted, I got it. Nothing left but go to heaven. Papa, no idea, building trade. Perhaps some branch or other fell off the scaffolding on his arse. No, the scaffolding that fell, and he with it landed on his arse. Dead burst. It must have been him, or the uncle. God knows. Mama, none, either column of jade Bible invisible in the black hand. Only the edge, red gilt. The black finger inside Psalm 100 and something. Oh God, man his days as grass, flower of the field, wind above in the clouds, the face, ivory pallor, muttering lips, all the lower, it's possible. Never anyone, never knew anyone, always ran, fled elsewhere, some other place, my life above, places, paths, nothing else, brief places, long paths, the quickest way, or 1,000 detours, the safest way, always at night, less light, a little less A to B, B to C, home at last, safe at last, drop, sleep. And this is one single page where most of the text blocks are one line long. What were we then, each for himself and for the other, glued together like a single body in the dark, the mud? How at each instant each ceased, and was there no more either for himself or for the other, vast tracts of time? And when we came back to be together for an instant again, when you come to think of that, cruelty, suffering, so paltry and brief, the paltry need of a life, a voice of one who has neither. The voice extorted a few words, life, because of cry, that's the proof, good and deep, no more is needed, a little cry, all is not dead, one drinks, one gives to drink goodbye. They were, I quote, good moments somehow, or other good moments when you think. Pym and me, part 2, and Baum and me, part 4, what that will be. To say after that we knew each other personally even then. Glued together like a single body in the dark, the mud. Motionless but for one right arm, brief flurry on, and of all the needful. To say after that I knew Pym, that Pym knew me, and Baum and I, that we shall know each other even fleetingly. You may say yes, and you may say no, it depends on what you hear. And in the very last line, we get a complement to the opening line, which creates a circular narrative. What stands out for me so much in reading Comment c'est, or How It is the handful of refrains that recur throughout the work, and how as this groping through the mud, groping for language really, sets into a stark pitch the power of these refrains by accumulation. And now we finally come to my favorite book in the Beckett canon, Watt. Like Murphy, like Mercier Camier, Watt also wasn't heard of, wasn't on the map at all. It would take Waiting for Godot and then the trilogy with Molloy, Malone Dies, and the Unnamable to finally bring books like Watt to the attention of audiences. The circumstances of the writing of this book are as extraordinary as the book itself. In fact, the magnificence of the book and the extraordinary circumstances under which it were written compound with each other to make this truly a standout book. In 1959, Donald Barr wrote a tepid review in the New York Times. It's just a very lukewarm review and typical of the thinking of what a novel was supposed to be at that time. He basically says, this book is going to bore the average reader. Nonetheless, Barr has this fantastic sentence that perhaps the author's heart is crying out that God is unfair, and his head is muttering that God does not exist. And he reconciles the two by blaming God for not existing. More recently, in 2017, John Michaud in The New Yorker would say that at its core, Watt is an investigation into the fallibility of reason, an attempt to reckon with obscure truths and alternative facts. Furthermore, on a humorous note that anyone who's read the book will love, he says that in order that the leftovers from Mr. Knott's twice daily meals be fed to the dog turns into a 40-page crisis. And then finally, he concludes it by saying, if Watt could keep Samuel Beckett from losing losing his mind, I decided. Perhaps it could do the same for me. I hope it's working. Yes, this was when Samuel Beckett and his partner Suzanne were on the run during Nazi-occupied France in World War II. Furthermore, as Deirdre Bair says, Beckett suffered a very real breakdown in Roussillon. Roussillon was the French countryside just outside of the occupied zone, but dangerous. Probably his most serious breakdown, one directly related to the schizophrenic form and content of much of Watt. Beckett called Watt only a game, a means of staying sane, a way to keep my hand in, which is a very eloquent way of saying I used novel writing as sublimation to keep a hold on my life, my existence, my mortality, my sanity. Bair gives us more of a sense of the psychological circumstance through which Beckett wrote Watt. Because he was without access to psychiatric help, Beckett was forced to muster astonishing reserves of self-control, to disguise his real intentions and feelings, and to force himself to act as if nothing untoward were happening, as if his inner being were not a raging battleground. He discovered that the most effective way to bring himself under control was to channel all his confusion through his writing. Filled with permutations and combinations, endless mathematical meanderings, a melange of suppositions and mental games, Watt ends with the ambiguous statement, "No symbols where none needed." It is the sort of novel a man might write who wanted relief, solace, and intellectual release from his physical surroundings. So again, Beckett wrote Watt in a desperate attempt to stave off complete mental breakdown and fill the book with dialogues and scenes from his own life. And I love this anecdote. Special blocks had to be made for both pages, meaning the pages of Watt, and these caused the only editorial problem. Shortly after the book was printed, the offices of Olympia Press were raided by a French vice squad in search of incriminating evidence for a pornography suit. They discovered the printing blocks and with enormous consternation and confusion held them up to mirrors, trying to decipher what they were convinced was a pornographic code. They seized the plates as evidence for the prosecution. And in Ireland, the novel was banned as soon as it appeared. For anyone who has any experience at all, any familiarity with anxiety, panic attacks, depression, things with which Beckett struggled all of his life. Really think about adding to that the fact that you are on the run. Your life is literally in mortal danger because Beckett helped the resistance cell, Gloria, funnel communication during occupied France, and that cell had been compromised by the Nazis. You're hiding under floorboards, you're hiding up in trees for days. You've finally self-exiled in a new place. All of your familiar surroundings have been ripped from you. You have no access to medication. You have no access to your psychiatrist. And so you summon, with whatever reserves are left in you, the strength to tether your very existence to a book in the hands of some guy in North Carolina who's going on and on about its greatness. What a story. It's also remarkable that if you didn't know about these circumstances, the book wouldn't give you any clue at all. There's no reference to the war, which is of course typical for Beckett. Your only clues would be the schizophrenic-like structure of the narrator, who's also the writer of the book, and who does yield the name Sam in one paragraph, almost accidentally, telling of Watt. And they literally conjoin and separate and mirror each other in the text. This is a text that is indebted to such predecessors as Tristram Shandy. There are lists, there's repetition, and endless permutation, and logical puzzles galore. In fact, much of this book reminded me of my days in programming classes, where we had to write programs that would take a list as input and then output all the possible permutations of that list. There are passages that threaten to get stuck in infinite loops of infinite regress. There are footnotes. There's an addenda that says it's even more important than the whole text, the main text itself. There are genealogies to rival those of the Old Testament. There's a 2-page rendering of a sort of musical score of 3 frogs croaking. If via Wittgenstein, the world is all that is the case, and in fact we have a character here named Mr. Case, then what Watt is doing is exploring every possible case that could be the case. It resembled them in the sense that it was not ended when it was past, but continued to unfold in Watt's head, from beginning to end, over and over again, the complex connections of its lights and shadows, the passing from silence to sound and from sound to silence, the stillness before the movement and the stillness after, the quickenings and retardings, the approaches and the separations, all the shifting detail of its march and ordinance, according to the irrevocable caprice of its taking place. It resembled them in the vigor with which it developed a purely plastic content and gradually lost in the nice processes of its light, its sound, its impacts, and its rhythm, all meaning even the most literal. Some of the hijinks and gags in this book point to the comedy routines that Beckett loved, such as those of Abbott and Costello. And in the addenda, I think there's a little buried nod to Laurel and Hardy, where a character author has encountered this old man, and he's asking the old man what kind of tree this is in the garden. And the old man says, that's what we calls a hardy laurel. And this is actually a prurient double entendre. But even on top of the double meaning, hardy laurel, this has to be a nod to Laurel and Hardy. Some of the pages made me feel like I was reading my daughter a Dr. Seuss book. The few glimpses caught of Mr. Knott by Watt were not clearly caught. Much critical attention has been given to the names that are used in here. Watt, of course, sounds like the word what, W-H-A-T, and Mr. Knott, which is spelled like the word for tying a knot, but with one extra T, also has knot. But knot in itself has three homonyms. There's not, which is a negation, there's not, which is something tied, and then there's not, meaning nothing. So this is a homonym for a logical operator in mathematics, not negating something. Mention has already been made of the difficulties that Watt encountered in his efforts to distinguish between what happened and what did not happen. To distinguish between what did happen and what did not happen. These characters' names are buried in that very statement. It could be said that Watt is Watt's attempt to establish what is not, and what Mr. Knott's purposes as a logical gate incarnate is to gate what Watt is not by negating what Watt says is Watt. Watt made no secret of this in his conversations with me, that many things described as happening in Mr. Knott's house, and of course grounds, perhaps never happened at all, or quite differently, and that many things described as being, or rather as not being, for these were more important, perhaps were not, or rather were, all the time. So what is it? It's an assault on logic. It's an assault on trying to make sense of things. And this assault also takes the form of compromising the integrity of definitive statements. This is one of my favorite things about the book, and where it gets so funny, because it's a very funny book. Almost every definitive statement that's offered is followed by a neurotic, obsessive attempt to find the cracks, the flaws, the loopholes in that definitive statement. Now, Erskine's room was always locked, and the key in Erskine's pocket. Or rather, Erskine's room was never unlocked, nor the key out of Erskine's pocket, longer than 2 or 3 seconds at a stretch, which was the time that Erskine took to take the key from his pocket, unlock his door on the outside, glide into his room, lock his door again on the inside, and slip the key back into his pocket. Or take the key from his pocket, unlock his door on the inside, glide out of his room, lock the door again on the outside, and slip the key back into his pocket. For if Erskine's room had been always locked, as the definitive statement said, and the key always in Erskine's pocket, then Erskine himself, for all his agility, would have been hard set to glide in and out of his room in the way he did, unless he glided in and glided out by the window, or the chimney. But in and out by the window he could not have glided without breaking his neck, nor in and out of the chimney without being crushed to death. And this was true also of Watt. And the humor works here because the things that we take for granted, that we don't even notice in everyday life, are seized upon by this narrator, and via this narrator by Watt, and toyed with endlessly by pure reason, we could say, to show how the thin layer of ice on the surface of our everyday language has cracks and splinters that threaten to give way and drown us all. And so there's an excessive amount of analysis and precision given to inspecting these everyday things that brings humor because of that discord between the perfunctory and the inconsequential and the treatment of something as if it's a matter of life and death. And it goes a level deeper too. The syntax comes into play. The use of commas, the way the commas are employed, helps to throttle the pacing of the reading such that the timing of the delivery is that of a comedic act. Listen to how these escalating commas really amp up the comedic delivery with each separated phrase. It was in vain that he had no love for dogs, greatly preferring rats. He could not have done otherwise, believe it or not. Then he did. And here we go. This is almost a staccato delivery. As it was, nothing happened, but all went on as before, apparently. Beckett is so aware of how absurd and funny life is. And in Watt, I think he achieves the creation of a world that mirrors the world in which he found himself, both in the external reality and in his chaotic internal reality, in such a way to where this will be a timeless book. This book will always be relevant and felt in any kind of present. But what's so notable about Samuel Beckett's work is that he's able to construct a world in a novel without any of the parts that were, especially in his time, required of novels. Plotting and characterization and rising action and denouement. All these are stripped away. Like Murphy, of course, the first book he wrote in English, this being the third and final novel he would write in English before switching over to French. There is more of the niceties, but this definitely less so than Murphy. There are just so many times reading this that I think to myself, I recognize this world. The plot, you could simply say it's a third party chronicling this very curious fellow named Watt and his time as a servant within Mr. Knott's house, which apparently Mr. Knott is another peculiar fellow who's the master of this house and employs all these servants. But really the plot is the language, the same way as it is in Waiting for Godot. What's the book about? It's about the words used. It's about the sorting out of each of its everyday situations in such a way that we take language to the limits of its logical possibilities. Probably the most sublime moment in this book is when Mr. Watt becomes inverted. And of course, things in logic can be inverted, just as they can be negated. This is an amazing moment where Beckett really shows what he can do in the mode of what I would call surrealist art house. The moment when the narrator is in a fenced-in yard adjacent to the yard in which Mr. Watt finds himself. But Mr. Watt has been inverted, and the two find a hole in the fence and are able to reconnect and then connect physically. This and then the templates were given of how this inversion with Watt affects his spoken language. These are things you don't get from other writers, or at least not very often. If you've never read Watt before, or if you've read it and you've cast it aside, and you approached it looking to pin it down and explicate its core meaning, I would ask that you give it another go. This time, throw all of your critical faculties out the door. Just take the book as it is. Simply enjoy what's going on. As that very last line says in the addenda, no symbols were none needed. Let's pretend that Samuel Beckett wasn't trying to give us symbols, wasn't trying to weave a secret message to all of us through the work, and just sit back and enjoy what a genius and an artist on the brink of madness in a historically catastrophic situation was able to do and to leave behind for all of us. I guarantee you'll find there's nothing like it and that it is extremely exciting. Now I'm just going to run through a bunch of great moments. Early on, we have a Mr. Nixon talking about Watt, but it's so funny that Mr. Nixon, and I'm thinking, of course, of President Nixon, whom Becket could not know. Mr. Nixon says that Watt is a most truthful man, really incapable, I believe, of telling an untruth. Some kind of crazy prophecy by proximity. For of course he is not as yet familiar with the premises. And I love that because he's talking about the grounds, the environs of Mr. Nott's house. But at the same time, premises are also a core component of logic. Here's a passage of text that reminds me of the best moments in David Foster Wallace's journalism, where he employs this highly technical language to talk about these seemingly insignificant things, thus raising them to almost mock significance. Between, on the one hand, a large pouch or bag containing the forenoon's supplies, cunningly dissimulated in the tattered skirt, and on the other, Mary's mouth. So there's a pouch down here and Mary's mouth. Mary's hands flash to and fro, with a regularity that I do not hesitate to compare with that of piston rods. At the moment that the one hand presses, with open palm, between the indefatigable jaws, a cold potato, onion, tart, or sandwich, the other darts into the pouch, and there, unerringly, fastens on a sandwich, onion, tart, or cold potato, as Mary wills. And the former, on its way down to be filled, meets the latter on its way up to be emptied, at a point equidistant from their points of departure, or arrival. And save for the flying arms and champing mouth and swallowing throat, not a muscle of Mary stirs. I love that imagery and the language used for it, just seeing these hands going from the pouch of food to the mouth is amazing. There's also a striving for completeness. It's not just verbal and logical excess because of being caught in a loop or just simply trying to be funny. It's a desperation for completeness that is a will-o'-the-wisp. It's also a preemption or a preemptiveness to cover all cases before any of them can be stepped into unawares. This would be a fault in logic, especially considering that Wittgenstein saying that the world is all that is the case. If we don't strive to know everything that is the case, we don't know our world. And it's very uncomfortable to live in a world one does not know. But that's the key to the book's universality and timelessness. We all are always coming into contact with things that make us concerned that we don't understand the world in which we're living. But what happens when we realize that this desperate attempt to pin down our world, and furthermore to use language to do so, has not only exhausted the language, has not only exhausted mathematics, but it has exhausted us. This is where I believe Samuel Beckett first gets the idea of striving to say nothing. This is especially apparent in Godot. This is what Theroux says about Watt. The novel Watt can serve as a general pattern for our understanding of the attempt to say nothing. For Watt, there are material phenomena, and there is a linguistic mechanism called mind, which manufactures meaning. But the notion that the meaning could actually reside in or be involved with the phenomena themselves is inconceivable. This is comforting to Watt. Nothing is mysterious or frightening or hostile, provided that the words are there to explain and define. And then he quotes from Watt, "I've made a pillow of old words for my head." The literalism of Watt, with the meticulous accumulation of detail, has buried in it the clumsy exactitude of legal prose. Watt tries to explain by language and therefore exercise as in get rid of a demon, the world around him at Mr. Nott's house. That is, he is trying to say something of which he cannot speak by confining his language to the most literal and inartistic naming of phenomena. This is what I've been trying to say, and Theroux does it much more eloquently. In the book, the narrator says that as Watt's interest in what has been called the spirit of Mr. Nott increased, his interest in what is commonly known as the body diminished. This was exactly what happened between Murphy and Mr. Enden in the psychiatric ward. Murphy became so interested in the spirit, the mind of Mr. Enden, that he lost such interest in his own physicality that he terminated it. There are a couple of really great poetic lines in here. In winter, there were the thin shadows writhing under our feet in the wild, withered grass. I really think that Thin Shadows Writhing would be a great title maybe for a poem or a short story. It was to be observed that the colors on the one hand of this coat, on the other of this hat, drew closer and closer the one to the other, with every passing luster. Yet how different had been their beginnings, the one green, the other yellow. So it is with time, that lightens what is dark and darkens what is light. It was to be expected that, once met, they would not stay, no, but continue, each as it must, to age, until the hat was green, the coat yellow. And then through the last circle's paling, deepening, swooning cease. The hat to be a hat, the coat to be a coat, for so it is with time. Watt's need of semantic succor was at times so great that he would set to trying names on things and on himself, almost as a woman hats. To sum up, Watt has gone beyond language into what can only be silence, for it's beyond language. Watt preferred, on the whole, having to do with things of which he did not know the name, to having to do with things of which the known name, the proven name, was not the name anymore for him. For the pot remained a pot. Watt felt sure of that for everyone but Watt. For Watt alone, it was not a pot anymore. I wasn't sure initially if I was going to add Waiting for Godot. In fact, if I'm really being honest, initially I told myself, don't add Waiting for Godot to this video. It's already going to be long enough, and what can be said about it? Everyone's heard of this. But in any case, I went and reread his play that put him on the map, and I realized that all of Beckett is contained within this short drama. One thing I realized this time around, and in fact, I read this while watching the San Quentin workshop dramatization or performance of it that's available on YouTube, and sort of reading along. And then I ended up the next day rereading through the play without any accompaniment. And I realized it had been 12 years since I had read it the first time, and I certainly didn't grasp everything going on. So it was a real treat, and one of those rare moments where I had to go back and start it over from the beginning, which if you're reading it, you know, it takes maybe an hour to get through. It's very brief. Most performances hit around the 2 hour and 15-minute mark. I realized, though, in the language and ideas, references, and allusions, that with this play, one way to think about it in literary terms is that at the left hand of the play is Shakespeare. At the right hand of the play is the Bible. And in the center of the play is the split personality of Samuel Beckett. This is going to be more of a commentary than a review. The refrain that we hear in the original French for En attendant Godot is rien à faire, rien à faire. In English, Samuel Beckett translated it as nothing to be done. A lot of this play can be summed up in the great quote that is attributed to all kinds of people, including John Lennon, that says, "Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans." This is one of the funniest pieces of literature I've ever read, and it's even better. It gets even more comedic value out of watching a performance of it. The repartee, the quick little jokes, the Abbott and Costello-like routines, but also the stage directions that are added in lend a lot to the humor, so it's still fun to just read. It does actually have a plot. It may not follow a Freytag diagram, but the plot is that we have two guys waiting for an entity named Godot, and various things happen to him while they're trying to figure out how to pass the time. Gogo, or Estragon, is the physically handicapped derelict who's more short and squat, and Didi, or Vladimir, is his companion who's tall and lanky and more given over to the academic sort of mind. One contrast between the two that's made explicit in the play is that Gogo knows he's unhappy, but Didi is unsure of whether he's happy or not. I also love the irony that the very entity, Godot, that keeps them ultimately confined is never present. Every time they remind each other that they have to wait for Godot, the other one goes, ah. It seems to never cross their minds that, hey, Godot's never coming, or hey, let's just blow this joint. Now, I mean, they don't react like that specifically when the other one is reminding them that they're waiting for Godot. Throughout the course of events, I think suicide comes up 3 or 4 different times, including very early on in the play with an allusion to or a reference back to the fact that Estragon apparently jumped into the Rhone to kill himself, but Vladimir got in there and rescued him. At times, it seems that everyone in the play has some sort of amnesia except for Vladimir, which makes for a more layered complexity of time. A couple of different well-known quotes will come to mind. Life is but a dream. All the world's a stage, from As You Like It, Shakespeare. When Pozzo and Lucky show up, Pozzo being this sort of cruel master and Lucky being this idiot who's full of sound and fury, but is also a slave to Pozzo, we get this really interesting contrast of a master-slave relationship between the two pairs on stage. On the one hand, we have Pozzo as a master who is visible. He's present. He has a physical rope tied around the slave's neck. Lucky, the slave, is thus in this physical image of determinism, having the master constantly telling him exactly what to say and do. Thus presents a nice little wink at the audience with the name Lucky. Yet, as compared to Estragon and Vladimir, who are slaves in their own way with a sort of pseudo-free will relationship to their master, the invisible, the unpresent Godot. So which one of the slave types is really lucky? Because in the scenario with Didi and Gogo, they're constantly trying to figure out what to do, while in the end, they do nothing. Let's back up for a second and see what Deirdre Bair said about Godot. En attendant Godot sprang full-blown from Beckett's head in a very brief time. The first page of the French manuscript bears the date 9th of October 1948 and the last 29 January 1949. Becket said he began to write Godot as a relaxation to get away from the awful prose I was writing at the time and from the wildness and rulelessness of the novels. It was like a game for him to put speeches on paper, envision the way characters should move and speak, all within the confines of the printed page and his mind. It was much like chess, plotting moves, foreseeing changes, and intellectualizing interactions. When Roger Blinn asked him who or what Godot stood for, Becket replied that it suggested itself to him by the slang word for boot in French, godillot godasse, because feet play such a prominent role in the play. And in fact, there is a little mystery that's put in there that I still am chewing on. However, Becket will never discuss the implications of the title. When the play was initially being talked about at the time of the first production, and Becket was hard-pressed for an answer, he would snap. If I knew who Godot was, I would have said so in the play. Or, if Godot were God, I would have called him that. Nonetheless, it's nearly irresistible to see Godot as at least a god type, and the play as at least partially a Christian commentary. He wanted to recreate a circus cum vaudeville atmosphere in a dramatic experience of total simplicity on which he would superimpose a pastiche of his ordinary, everyday thought and conversation. I think he succeeded, and that's very eloquently stated. Christian interpretations of the play have always irritated Becket. Now she's quoting him. Christianity is a mythology with which I am perfectly familiar, and so I use it. But not in this case. I'm not so sure. There's so much explicit reference to the thieves at the cross, to Estragon saying that he's tried all his life to be Christ-like. Ultimately, what is so striking about the play, and what must have been particularly arresting to the first French audience, is the language. Becket was the first post-war playwright to write dialogue in everyday, ordinary spoken French. So much activity required Beckett's attention that he wrote nothing during 1951, and had no new work in mind. His only concern was Godot. He decided to step in and take a more active role in bringing the play before an audience. It was one of the most important decisions of his life. In effect, it signaled the end of his career as a writer of prose and the beginning of his long involvement with drama. In the introduction to this bilingual edition from Grove, it says that viewed in its full multiplicity, the unmistakably Irish play becomes at least as unmistakably French, its Gaelic references as prominent as its Hibernian. When we think about en attendant, which is in French an adverb that accents the burden of time in the title more directly than the English text, which on the other hand is given a specific subtitle, Tragicomedy in 2 Acts, missing from the French. And as I was going through the bilingual edition, it was very interesting to see Beckett's choices. And that's what's so great about this, is that he wrote the French of the original play, and he produced the English translation, as he would with all of his work. We begin with that refrain, rien à faire, or nothing to be done. And this is sort of like the opening of Ecclesiastes, which is the same tack that Beckett took at the beginning of Murphy. At the very beginning of the play, Vladimir says, I'm tired telling you that. Why don't you listen to me? And they're talking about the fiasco of taking off Estragon's boots. But this shows us that these events are repeating. This is our first hint that we may be in some kind of time loop. When Estragon points out that Vladimir's pants are unbuttoned, Vladimir says, true. And he buttons his fly, such as the stage direction. And then he goes, never neglect the little things of life. And it's kind of funny when you read it, but in the performance, it really gets the full effect of the comedic value. And then Vladimir, right after that, decides to quote Proverbs 13:12, hope deferred maketh the something sick. Who said that? Well, Solomon, who may be the same person that wrote Ecclesiastes. These great little exchanges. Vladimir says, you should have been a poet. Estragon says, I was. And then the stage direction says for him to gesture toward his rags. Isn't that obvious? It's great to see the image of dereliction as affirmation of the office of a poet. There are all these loaded words and turns of phrase and puns, and some of these exchanges happen so rapidly that you won't catch it on the first time. I've now read this 3 times, and there's still stuff that I'm catching. When they're talking about the thieves up on the crucifixes with Christ, Estragon says, saved from what? Vladimir says, hell. Estragon says, I'm going. And it's an amusing double entendre. He could be referring to, I'm getting out of here, or I'm going to hell, like you just named. This amusing double entendre must primarily mean to hell, because the stage direction that's given is that he is not to move. Then again, it could just be the ambiguity that Beckett keeps reasserting. There are moments such as when Estragon says, charming spot. Then he turns, advances to the front, and halts facing the auditorium, or facing us, the audience. And he goes, inspiring prospects. And the way he says it, and in context, it's a nice little slight to the audience. One mystery or wonderful bone to chew on is how when Estragon keeps waking up and saying he has had a dream, Vladimir pretty much freaks out and says, no, please don't tell me about your dream. You know I don't like that. And in fact, at one point in all capital letters, Vladimir says, don't tell me. And Estragon replies, gesturing toward the universe, as it tells us, this one is enough for you? So again, the world as dream, reality as dream, world as stage. So many little moments are thrown in that capture something universal within all of us, such as when Vladimir says, let's wait till we know exactly how we stand. This is a frequent aspiration in we humans. We want so badly to know where we stand in life. But by whose standards? Godot's? Our own? Those around us? Is it a feeling we're looking for? With Pozzo smoking his pipe, we get that view of pleasure and desire. He says, the second is never so sweet, meaning the second puff on his pipe. As the first, I mean, but it's sweet just the same. Pozzo also alludes to both Kierkegaard and St. Paul in Philippians 2:12, which tells us to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. Fear and trembling being the quote that Pozzo uses. Also the name of Kierkegaard's study of the near sacrifice of Isaac on Mount Moriah in Genesis. I think these point to 2 profound thoughts, because Gogo and Didi can be seen as looking for salvation through Godot. And so they're having to come face to face with working it out in fear and trembling. And the implications of Abraham and Isaac and Mount Moriah are so vast that I'll save them for another video. Just to be brief, I think what it mainly hints at is it about what we've decided in our hearts or what we actually do? There's a hilarious moment where Pozzo consults his watch as he's saying, I think it was nearly 60 years ago. But even though it's funny and gets, it's a nice little gag for the audience, at the same time, I think it's pointing to the complexity of time as presented in Waiting for Godot. In some cases, it can feel like they're either in a loop or in some kind of purgatory. We know, of course, that Beckett was very, very fond of Dante. Dante. At one moment, Vladimir says, Gogo, don't go on like that. Tomorrow, everything will be better. I remember reading Kerouac, and he talked about his time in Mexico and how the Mexicans say, mañana, mañana. It'll be better tomorrow, or we can just do that tomorrow. Put everything off for mañana. But in a way, mañana, tomorrow, or at least the promise of it making everything better or something getting done, never comes. Tomorrow is always in the future. Estragon, wait. I sometimes wonder if we wouldn't have been better off alone, each one for himself. We weren't made for the same road. Vladimir, it's not certain. Estragon, no, nothing is certain. The two acts end with the exact same exchange and stage directions, only the speakers are reversed. So at the end of the first act, Estragon says, well, shall we go? And Vladimir responds, yes, let's go. The stage direction says, they do not move. And then curtain. And the same thing will happen at the end of Act 2, except Vladimir will be the one who says, well, shall we go? And Estragon, yes, let's go. Then at the start of Act 2, pretty much repeats what happened at the start of Act 1. Estragon says, I tell you, I wasn't doing anything. And Vladimir replies, perhaps you weren't, but it's the way of doing it that counts. The way of doing it if you want to go on living. And if you read this in the context of Estragon saying, I wasn't doing anything, then what Vladimir is actually saying is the way of doing nothing is what matters, which is a very Beckett thing. There's this exchange that begins with Estragon saying all the dead voices in Act 2 that really gets me every time. And it starts, Estragon, all the dead voices. They make a noise like wings, like leaves, like sand, like leaves, silence. Vladimir. They all speak at once, each one to itself. Silence. Vladimir. Rather they whisper, rather they rustle. They murmur, they rustle. Silence. Vladimir. What do they say? They speak about their lives. To have lived is not enough for them. They have to talk about it. To be dead is not enough for them. It is not sufficient. Silence. Vladimir. They make a noise like feathers, like leaves, like ashes, like leaves. Long silence. And then Vladimir. Say something. Estragon. I'm trying. One of the most sublime passages in the entire play. But then one of the most sublime moments, and a clear allusion, I think, to Descartes, who was very important to Becket, is when Vladimir says, what is terrible is to have thought. What is terrible is cogito ergo sum. Estragon, and the stage direction says aphoristic for once. We are all born mad. Some remain so. Madness is, of course, heavy on Beckett's mind all the time, from the moment when he met some insane and schizophrenic people in his actual life, but then also channeled it into Mr. Enden in Murphy. Pozzo turns Shakespearean toward the end of the play, and he says, one day we were born, one day we shall die, the same day, the same second. Is that not enough for you? They give birth astride of a grave. The light gleams an instant, then it's night once more. What else can I say about Waiting for Godot, except to read it again and perhaps do another video? But I can't argue with the fact that it's probably his greatest work.